Good morning, everyone. I'm Sandra Martin, and I'm the head of Newsroom Development at the Globe and Mail, and I'd like to welcome you all to the event this morning. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which the Globe and Mail is situated is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Métis Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We're so grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. We're delighted to see all of you here in person at the Globe and Mail Center, and of course would like to welcome those in the audience who are joining us virtually this morning from all across Canada. Today's event is the first in a series called The Future of Canada. And as the pandemic begins to recede, we thought it would be an opportune time to bring leaders from across the country together to talk about where we go from here. And over the course of the day, we'll have conversations about the economy, Canada's role in the world, climate change, technology, and innovation, all moderated by Globe and Mail journalists. On behalf of the Globe and Mail, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's event, including Google, Bruce Power, and Northland Power. And on that note, we have a short video from one of our partners.
Hi, I'm Leila, and I play tennis all over the world. I speak 3 languages, but the new Pixel 6 speaks like 45.
Come ti senti dopo della tua vittoria di oggi?
Hungry.
Ha fame di più vittoria?
It's super helpful when I want something. With extra sauce, please.
Mit extra Soße.
Just like my backhand. I'm pretty good with my racket, but I'm a pro with my Pixel 6.
Next up, we will be welcoming our panelists for the first discussion to the stage. I'm the head of Newsroom Development here at the Globe and Mail. In case you missed our opening remarks, my name's Sandra Martin, and I'll be moderating the next panel. Next up, we're going to be talking about people and population. So Canada is getting set to welcome a record high number of immigrants over the next 2 years, in part to grow and sustain our population. At the same time, there's increasing recognition that we need to do more to support the success of our population overall and to help ensure that future growth is inclusive. So we have a terrific group to tackle that project, or that topic, and I'm going to introduce them right now. First up, we have Philippe Ducharme. He's Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Procurement with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Welcome. Next, we have Shamira Madani, Managing Director for Canada and Deputy Executive Director with World Education Services. Thanks for joining us. We also have Diana Lee, Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion for TD Bank Group. And joining us remotely, last but not least, we have Dr. Kwame McKenzie, CEO of the Wellesley Institute. Please welcome all of our panelists. Okay, so we're going to hunker down and have a really meaty conversation. We had a chance to chat a little bit beforehand about what's on your mind, so why don't we just dive right in and make the most of our 40 minutes together. I'm going to reach out to Kwame, Dr. McKenzie, joining us virtually. Let's start with you. You and many others feel that the pandemic has underscored inequality in Canada's current population, especially among marginalized groups. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, and thank you, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak. I hope you can hear me well, Sandra. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Perfect. So, I mean, we know that immigration is a main driver of population growth, and the plan is to increase immigration to backfill labour shortages left by boomers, to grow the population, to grow the economy, and to build a stronger society. And we know that that's really always been Canada's plan and Canada's success. And I loved Tariq's speech because of Tariq's energy, his innovation, and his love, which is typical of many of the immigrants I know. But I think generally we don't look after newcomers and immigrants as well as we've looked after Tariq's families. 3 examples. Immigrants to Canada are better physically and mentally when they come to Canada, but 7 years later, they're worse physically and mentally than people born in Canada. racial hatred is on the rise, and some of our racialized populations in Canada have poverty rates which is 60% higher than the white population, even though they're better educated. And when we came to COVID, we found that our immigrant and racialized populations had much higher rates of COVID, and our pandemic strategies were much more ineffective. And so I think I'm a proud Canadian, very much like Tarek. I'm glad to be here. I've been here 14 years. I love this country, even though I'm speaking to you from Geneva just at the moment. But I think there's more we can do to make sure that one of our biggest investments, and that's in immigration, actually ends up being an engine of our future economy.
Okay, just following up on that a little bit, the challenges that you just discussed among newcomers to Canada and racialized populations, what do those challenges mean in regard to Canada's aim to grow our population through welcoming more newcomers? What do we need to be aware of?
Well, I think one of the things we've got to realize is that is what we're talking about is a significant waste of potential. And we should be concerned. We should be concerned because most of the problems are preventable. They're linked to stress, racism, bad jobs, bad housing and poorer access to preventive health measures and social supports. And we should also be concerned because it actually costs more to keep people in poverty than it does to pull them out of poverty. And our poverty reduction strategies don't equitably reach immigrant and racialized communities. And we need to change these statistics because if we get the reputation of not being a place where immigrants can thrive, we won't get the types of economic migrants that we want. And if we don't change some of these statistics around health problems, mental health problems, and poverty and social inclusion, then we will not be able to realize the very many benefits that come from having a diverse immigrant population full of entrepreneurs, innovators, social entrepreneurs, and people who want to make Canada a better place.
All right, thank you. Philip, I'm going to turn to you next. So you've pointed out that Indigenous populations are incredibly important to the growth of Canada, the future of Canada, but sometimes are left out of the conversation. Can you elaborate on that?
Thanks, Sandra. I also want to thank you for opening with the traditional acknowledgement of our traditional territories. It is good to be here. We're starting to come live events now, but I didn't realize I'd be looking at myself in a camera as well. I'm getting kind of tired of looking at myself, so I do have cheat notes with me. Anyone that's been doing virtual knows they have their little notes, or you have your little teleprompter, I think, on your computers. So I think when we started talking about this discussion, and a lot of it was focusing on the immigrants that are coming to Canada, I think the Indigenous people are a very underrepresented group in Canada. We haven't had the opportunities. As an Indigenous person myself, when I look at, and I listened to the keynote's speech this morning, I thought, that's great that he found that from Canada, but it's not, as my previous colleague also said, it's not always that simple. I think Indigenous peoples have been left out in so many areas. I mean, we were the last people, First Nations were the last people that were recognized as peoples in Canada. Up until 1962, newcomers, any other person in Canada was allowed to vote, but First Nations were only allowed to vote and were recognized as peoples in 1962. So I think when we look at it, the Indigenous population is really growing. Between 2016 and 2026, there's going to be 350,000 Indigenous working aged people that are coming to the forefront, and we need to ensure that we have those opportunities to grow in it. I can go on, but I know there's quite a few of us here, but it's I think we have to be inclusive of our Indigenous people.
Okay, thanks for that. We'll come back to you on that. Moving next to you, Shamira. Speaking of inclusion, Canadians are among the most educated people in the world, and yet education or experience gained in other countries doesn't seem to count in the same way. What are the main challenges for newcomers, given this reality, who want to make a life in Canada?
Sure. What I'm going to do is basically set the context a little bit and actually build on what Tarek said, because the lens I'm going to use is really from strength to strength, rather than from strength to deficit to try and get back to strength. For me, what's really important here in terms of the context is that currently 82% of the population growth comes from immigrants. And in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be 100%. That's one. Two is that we have almost 1 million jobs that are vacant, and we can't fill these vacancies. And yet, as we have immigrants coming in, it's about 500,000 a year, 1 million in the last 3 years. You have employers who are saying, we don't have people to fill our vacancies, and you have immigrants who are saying, but you're not looking at our prior education and experience. 60% of all those immigrants who come to Canada actually have either master's level or PhDs and a lot of experience. And what's happening from a challenge perspective is that it appears to me that licensing bodies don't know how to take that experience and basically provide the necessary tools to assess the experience and go back to being a nurse, if that's what you are. And employers don't know how to evaluate, basically, again, education and experience, especially experience, the competencies as to what it looks like in Canada. And so for me, the whole issue is about we need long-term systemic change in terms of understanding the strengths that people bring in, and we need to change systems. So the analogy that I always use is about climate, because I know we'll be talking about climate change in a few minutes. We are handing out umbrellas to people as they come in to try and prevent the rain from falling from them. On them. What we really need is to change the climate. We need to change legislation, policies, reduce barriers so people can come in and integrate it into the labor market. And again, I can speak a lot more to that.
How does your work with World Education Services tie into what you're talking about here?
Absolutely. So World Education Services is a social enterprise, not-for-profit organization, and we assess academic qualifications for individuals coming from other countries. We do about 500,000 a year. And so it's the first barrier that most individuals will face. What does your BA or MA look like in the Canadian or US system? And that basically is what individuals will use to either go back to post-secondary education, to get licensed, or to get into the employment market. The issue that individuals run into, and especially you've heard Tarek and some others talk about here, is that if 60% of immigrants who are coming here are already highly educated, they didn't just graduate. They might have 10, 15 years of experience, and we don't know how to assess that experience in order to enter the labor market. So what World Education Services does is to bring in decision makers like licensing bodies, post-secondary institutions, employers, individuals, because again, what I heard from Tarek is that it's, for people who have lived experience have to co-create what the systems are and to change the systems. And so what World Education Services does is brings all these groups together, because currently they're working in silos, and having constructive conversations in what we need to do. Stop talking about the problems, move into what the solutions are so that our country can continue to prosper.
Okay, thanks. And Diana, that's a great segue to you as you bring the voice of business to the discussion. So as TD looks to hire to fill talent gaps, what are some of the solutions that you're looking to?
I'll start off by saying from a private sector business perspective, these concepts of diversity and inclusion are obviously so crucial. And oftentimes when, the topic comes up in private sector conversations, the perspective that, we're asked to bring is, what's the business case? To me, I have mixed feelings about this sort of formulation of the value of D&I. There are endless studies that demonstrate, why diversity and inclusion and really setting up a culture that truly embraces difference across all dimensions, why that leads to outperformance, in terms of financial results, greater innovation, et cetera. But I think more fundamentally than that, what we've realized in particular in recent years, but I think within TD, has been part of our culture as an organization for decades, is really that this is the right thing to do. And so, whether you're thinking about it from a colleague perspective, as you mentioned, thinking about how you're bringing the best talent in, you obviously want to get the best talent from all backgrounds to support your business imperatives. In addition, from a customer perspective, there's obviously, so much potential out there in terms of, new to Canada, but delivering the best banking experience to every customer, like that is our purpose, to be the better bank. And so, fundamentally, it's something that it's more than just the business imperative to us. It's more than, studies like McKinsey just had a recent one in 2021 that demonstrated, there's actually an increase in this outsized performance year over year. If you get diversity and inclusion right, you'll see those results track upwards over time. All of that is great and all of that is true, but I think we also need to recognize you need to do the work within your organization, right? You can't just have a culture, a certain culture, particularly if you don't have diverse representation, add in others from other backgrounds and expect things to flourish. You need to have the right culture that embraces different backgrounds, that creates that environment of inclusion in order to see those outsized results. And so, when we think about the kinds of initiatives or efforts that we have in place in order to both bring in this talent from the outside as well as create the environment that we need from the inside, it's about tackling it from all angles, right? Having the kind of awareness and accountability within the organization, as well as doing what we can externally to make sure that our brand is known in terms of what we're doing to support customers, colleagues, and communities from all backgrounds, and really create an environment where we are supporting that diverse talent as they come into the organization.
So particularly in a large organization, high level, what are some of the tactical things that you can do to create that culture change that's necessary for a broader range of employees, team members to flourish?
A couple of comments that have come up today stand out to me and really do resonate. One is this idea that you need to have these solutions co-created or built by members of communities. And so, as you said, we're a large organization and we have the benefit of having colleagues from all different backgrounds who support us in the development of initiatives. So for example, last year, a new mentoring program was developed specific to Indigenous peoples, really driving career development for Indigenous peoples at all levels within the organization. And that's in partnership with allies, at all levels from across the organization. And so really when we're looking for solutions, I think making sure that we are welcoming and taking seriously the perspectives of those we have, both within the organization and outside, is crucial. In addition, though, I think being intentional about your efforts. So we have diversity sourcing teams that are focused on specific communities that understand the experiences and some of the particular challenges that individuals from different groups can face, and can support both those applicants as well as hiring managers in creating that kind of inclusive experience from the first moment that somebody submits an application. And so I think recognizing that you have to have that understanding of the groups that you are trying to serve, trying to support, that is crucial to success.
And perhaps we could hear from all of our panelists to answer the next question. We know that this is a tight labor market. Many companies are competing for talent. As we discuss, whether it's Indigenous peoples who are a growing population or immigrants that are coming to Canada in large numbers, what do employers need to do in order to attract that talent, knowing, especially if people are coming from the outside or they're talking about moving, from province to province in order to seek work? what can employers do to attract talent, knowing that there is a choice? Kwame, perhaps you could start.
Thanks. And I just wanted to start off by saying that I just love the way that this panel's going, and love what Philip's had to say, and Samira and Diana. And I really liked where she left off on this idea of co-designing people's futures, because we know that people would like to go somewhere where they believe that the employer is fair, where the employer includes them and they can co-design their future, and where there is an environment where they can grow. And people like that. And I would say to a number of employers, do you want a short-term fix, or do you want long-term prosperity? Because if you want a short-term fix, yeah, you can invite people into an environment that's not going to really allow them to thrive. Or you can take them on a journey with you to a place where they feel completely included, they feel like they're co-designing their future, they feel like they've got a career and a good job, and they will then deliver for you. But you have to really think of people as an investment, think of how you're going to manage their talent, and be very clear to people that they are joining. They're joining something. It's more than a job. It's actually, they're joining a company or a family. And I think that people like that. And as Diana said, if people are very clear about certainly the environment, the EDI environment, that it's really important. And as she said, McKinsey, not Mackenzie. I'd have loved to have done that study, but it wasn't me. McKinsey studies show that having a more diverse workforce pays off for you and the bottom line of your business.
In addition to doing the work of, creating a culture that is inviting and inclusive, how important, keeping with the conversation we're having, is it to outreach to the populations that you want to attract? Philip, maybe we can start with you.
I think it is very important. And again, I think the inclusive, to make sure that we feel inclusive and that we're part of the community. I think also bringing in more of the people that you're targeting as in executive positions. I mean, if you look at Canada, I think a few years ago, within the last 2 years, 3 of the top companies in Canada brought on an Indigenous board member. They've never had that before. 2 of our national banks brought them on, TD being one of them. Cherie Brandt, who's a board member, RBC, and then TELUS also brought that on. And I think by bringing out and even having the role models or the mentors that are coming in and showing that. So I mean, there's nothing makes you feel prouder than seeing someone that looks like you in a position of authority, or someone that's there to welcome you in the communities. I think with the Indigenous people, again, I'm speaking for the Indigenous, I can't speak to the other sector groups, but with Indigenous people, we've been told so often, this is what you need to do. We're never talked to, we don't have the dialogue. And I think right now a lot of these companies are bringing in Indigenous working groups within their organizations, and they are reaching out to the groups, and then they're saying, like, this is a safe environment. I think so often we have to feel safe to be able to thrive. So I think we're going in the right step. There is movement, but again, I think we need the role models, we need the mentors that are going to help us to bring in the new employees.
All right, thank you. Samira, what's your thought?
Sure. I usually talk about issues at a systemic level. And so it isn't about just individuals, it's about changing systems. So if I think about it in sort of 3 buckets, recruitment and sourcing individuals in the right places. We've just talked about that. The second is selection. So for me, selection becomes really important. As I indicated, it's not just a resume, because a resume is full of biases. What school did you go to? How many years of experience? It's not the actual experience. And so what employers should be doing is looking at tools as to how to assess skills and competencies that people bring. If there were an engineer in their home country, it isn't just, what school did you go to, how many years? It's what are the skill sets that an engineer needs? they're the same, whether it's project management, some technical skills, and how do I assess this in a fair and merit-based way. So I think that we need to be developing tools that are consistently used by all employers, and it could be done together. And then once the individual is in the workplace, it isn't about just, I have a diverse workplace. It's about how do I ensure that I'm inclusive in terms of listening to people's voices. Something as simple as during the month of Ramadan, and I know that this is pre-COVID, but during the month of Ramadan, to have lunch meetings when you might have a large contingent of Muslim employees is a really good example of being intentional or not. So to me, it's really thinking about those three buckets and being very intentional in terms of the kind of systems you build, and then being practical in executing the systems.
All right. And Diana, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the one dimension that I think might be worth adding, lots of really fantastic points from the others. I think increasingly when talent are looking at organizations, they're looking at organizations as a whole, and so they're assessing your performance and your approach to your business and your customers as much as they're assessing the colleague experience and what others are saying about whether they like working there. And so that goes hand in hand with our approach. Our approach to diversity and inclusion has spanned all dimensions of our organization for quite a while in terms of the, how we treat our customers, the products and services we offer, how we approach the colleague experience, as well as our philanthropic and community support. And so, I think there has to be that genuine commitment to these values, and that genuine commitment is shown through consistency across your organization. It's not something that you talk about, on D&I Day or on a particular, day of acknowledgement. That's important too, but it has to also be something that infiltrates like how you approach your business, every initiative or every project.
All right, thanks for that. And so, Kwame, I want to come back to the comment you made about how the pandemic has not affected all of the groups across Canada equally. As we come to this critical point in the COVID-19 pandemic, what are some of the solutions you'd like to see put in place to help ensure that more people are brought along in the recovery?
Well, thanks very much for that question. So let me take you back to summer 2020, wave one of the pandemic. And let me take you to Toronto, where 50% of the population's immigrants, and it is one of the engines of the economy. The city was collecting race-based data to monitor the pandemic and found out that the rate of COVID in Black populations and other racialized groups was up to 10 times higher than the white population. So what they did is they set up consultations to try and decide what to do, and they changed their pandemic interventions to ensure that they worked for racialized groups and took action on social factors to change the environment in which racialized groups were living, such as housing protection so that people weren't evicted, and food security work. So if you take the Black population, August 2020, the rate of COVID in Toronto was 9 times that of the white population. Once they brought in this community co-developed pandemic strategy, they brought the rate right down so that by December, it was 2 times the rate of the white population. Still, there were disparities, but from 9 times to 2 times. And all they did was had a commitment to measure disparities, co-develop strategies to decrease those disparities with communities, right? And then follow through with what they said. And we have those tools at all levels of society to make a difference. And we can do it, and we've shown we can do it in the pandemic, and we could do it in the recovery. But we've got the tools and skills. We need to develop the policies, we need to resource it, and of course, we need the political will. But if we don't do that, if we don't actually look after our vital resource, then I think it's going to be much more difficult for us to have the recovery that, quite frankly, having gone through what everybody's gone through, the recovery that we deserve.
Okay, and Philip, I'd like to ask you the same question.
Well, I think with COVID, it really affected our Indigenous businesses. A lot of our smaller businesses really relied on getting out into the communities, especially the ones that were the artisans, going to the powwows, going to the trade shows. And I think it's really shown the gap, the digital gap with Indigenous communities and their ability to connect. About 25% of our Indigenous businesses that are members of ours didn't even have a website prior to COVID. And once COVID came, if they didn't have a website, you were even that much further behind. I do want to do a shout out to Google. I know I'm not supposed to, but Google actually is one of our partners. And one of the things that they've done is they've given us a grant to help our Indigenous businesses. So many times when people are helping the businesses, they say, well, you got to do this, but you have all these sort of requirements to be able to do this. They gave us a grant, and this is open to Indigenous businesses to help them get connected, to even build websites. And they're given $2,500 to do what they want, whereas so many other things, you have to do this, or you have to spend it on this one, it's got to be done this way. I think really, Google, thank you so much for affording that for our Indigenous businesses. But again, I think Indigenous people as well, when you look in the Yukon Territory, there's 13 First Nations that have actually partnered with the local internet provider, and they're going to try and make sure that the communities are connected. So we're having to work with other people, so I think the partnerships is helping with that as well with this. But again, COVID was, you really had to be online, like everything you were doing. Again, all your meetings were online, all of your things, and even the communities in the past had to go to the doctors, but now they're trying to get online, but if you don't have internet, you're not going to be doing that. So I think COVID and connectivity is really an area that we have to focus on for our Indigenous peoples and businesses.
Okay, thanks. And Samira, what policy supports or solutions do you think would help to remove the barriers that newcomers to Canada face in finding work, building a career beyond just finding a job, and truly building a life in this country?
Basically, in terms of, and I'm going to answer the question again at a macro level, the first thing that we need to do, because we are in a war for talent across the world, it's not just Canada. And so we have to modernize our immigration systems. We have a backlog of, I think it's about 2.4 million applications. And people are watching this, and they're choosing to go to other countries. So I know that the government is doing something, but they have to go faster and be a lot more proactive. So our immigration systems and processing applications will have to be faster using modern technology. The second is, again, tools to assess people's international credentials. We still have people whose academic credentials are not being recognized. And so we have to understand that educational systems are educational systems. We are not, superior to others. It's just an understanding of how that works. And thirdly, it's to make sure that we don't blame individuals or say there are deficits with individuals. We've got to get employers, licensing bodies, and basically settlement agencies working together to think about what the solutions are. Because it's been, at least in the time that I've been in this sector, 20 years, we can't keep on talking about doctors driving cabs and now doctors driving Ubers. We've got to stop talking about that and moving into, and so where do we go from here fast and using technology to move forward.
Okay, and Diana, same question to you from the perspective of business. What are some supports or solutions that could help sort of unclog that talent pipeline for newcomers?
I think it does go back to me again to you have to look at all dimensions of your business. And so I think one area really of focus for us is recognizing our responsibility as a financial institution in, what can we do to help break down those barriers for individuals and groups, who are facing, challenges that are unequal and often systemic. And so, while that might seem separate and apart from the talent question, I see a direct link there. It's again about, if there is this real commitment to these important values, then you're going to see that demonstrated across your organization as opposed to just where it's convenient. And so similarly to how I spoke about having our focused diversity sourcing resources that are looking at Indigenous talent, looking at Black talent, other groups, we have similar teams focused on bringing the whole bank, everything from access to credit to providing the right customer service, understanding the community needs with respect to Black communities as well as Indigenous peoples. And so I think that there is a lot of value in that intentionality. Of course, in addition to that, in any specific efforts, you need to have that kind of culture of consistent, respectful inclusion across your whole organization. And so that's something that we're absolutely focused on, both in terms of the colleague experience as well as the customer experience. But really, I think it's when you're demonstrating to talent why this is the place that is right for them, that is truly a wonderful place to work, demonstrating commitment to diversity and inclusion across all that you do is so crucial.
All right, thanks. And in the time we have left, I want to invite our audience here, as well as those who are joining virtually, to ask any questions. If there's anyone on the floor here who has a question, I'd ask you to raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Yes, sir. Just one moment while we get the microphone to you.
On one level, I can't resist. Can you hear me? I cannot resist. It's almost a UN conference in Geneva. Anodyne, nice and sweet. The most precious resource is that of intellectual horsepower. And I've been privileged in terms of when I'm abroad, I do pro bono teaching. When I was in Liberia doing le droit administratif public, the last thing Liberia needs are more lawyers. What they need are teacher educators and nurse practitioners. And I agree or I do not disagree. What needs to be done is long-term transformative involving the municipal, provincial, and federal agencies along with colleges and universities in terms of what I call a pipeline, in terms of, let's say something, say simple, medical education. The majority of resources are post-MD in terms of infrastructure. How do you engage in the talent, bringing them in, that they have the intelligence, they have the capacity? What is needed is a year or two of what I call social, civic, intellectual amelioration in terms of knowing the local nomenclature, whether in Canada, whether in Kinshasa, whether in Monrovia. There is always what I call the local nomenclature. And once that is brought up, these people in their various talents can be deployed, sought, seeked, going through. And again, I'm not disagreeing with anything what is said. It's going to what I call the polarities in our governance infrastructure. There's less talk in terms of action. As I said earlier on, our civics are in a state of acute fragility. One does not know how fragile. The veneer is actually vapor thin. I've seen it. I've seen it abroad when elements have imploded overnight. And you can go from civility. And we are fortunate in this country that we attract many good people. But the key is, how do you integrate? There's nothing worse than having someone with a brain, talent, not doing what he or she wants to do. The frustration builds, and then you're looking for scapegoats. Arlie Hochschild, in her magisterial book, Ill Fares the Land, and I encourage you all to read that, is highly academic, but she plumbed it pre-Trump, what I call the populace in terms of what is happening. I thank you.
Okay, this is going to have to be our last question. Thanks so much, sir.
Just one more point to make. With regards to immigration, it's very important to think about quality and not just quantity. We don't want quantity entering Canada. We want to see some quality come here. That's more important than just bringing hordes of people into the country who are just going to cause problems. And we have to do better background checks on everybody coming here, so to make life more safe for all the local people and everybody in the country. It's quality, not quantity, that matters. Thank you.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there today. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to say thank you to our panel, Philip, Samira, Diana, Kwame. We're going to take a short break in a bit, but before we do, I would like you to watch this video from one of our partners.
Hi everyone, hope that was a restful and useful break for you. We want to come on back in here. We're going to continue with the program now. Let me introduce myself first. I'm David Parkinson. I'm an economics columnist here at the Globe and Mail, and we're going to shift the conversation to the Bank of Canada and some of the more pressing economic issues that are facing us both short term and in a little bit longer term. Obviously, the economy is a very hot topic right now for everybody. We're all keenly aware of the impact of high inflation, both on a household level, on a level of anybody operating a business, and of course the people in this country who are in the positions of power and who are setting policy, economic policy for this country, are also obviously keenly aware and very closely watching the same things we all are every day, which is why we are extremely fortunate this morning to have a guest who is in one of those top positions of power in this country. Carolyn Rogers is the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada. That's the number 2 position at the central bank, and as I'm sure you're all aware, the central bank is the institution that has been raising interest rates more aggressively than it has in decades in order to try to get a handle on an inflation crisis that itself is the biggest inflation problem that the country has faced in 30 or 40 years now when we look at the numbers. We are, as I said, Ms. Rogers is here today. She assumed the position of Senior Deputy Governor last December, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is only her second public speaking event since she took the post. So we are, in fact, very honored that she chose to join us here. So with that, please welcome me in joining Carolyn Rogers to the stage. So, Carolyn, I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room. A couple of hours ago, we got fresh inflation numbers, and we're now looking at a number that is the highest rate of inflation this country has seen in nearly 40 years. I'd like to know, I guess, get your response to the data that we saw this morning, how it fits with what the Bank of Canada has been looking at in terms of its forecasts. And where do we go from here, and what should we be most worried about?
Sure, yeah. Well, let me start just by saying thanks to you, David, and to the Globe and Mail for the chance to be here today. It's actually, as I was saying to you just before we came on stage, it's good timing for us with the StatsCan data out today. As you say, a big number, so it's a good chance for us to talk to Canadians and tell you how the bank is thinking about the current outlook, current situation. So, like you, we got the current data from Stats Canada about 2 hours ago. I can assure you there is a big team of people in a room at the Bank of Canada right now pulling those numbers apart. So I'm not at this point in a position to give you a real detailed breakdown on that number. What I can say is, while it's an unwelcome number, inflation is much too high in Canada, it's not an entirely unexpected number. You would have heard us say at our last rate decision that we do expect inflation to tick up a bit higher in the near term, and that is exactly what we see in the number today. Where do we go from here? as we've said sort of at the last couple of rate decisions, we continue to say inflation is too high. It's too high. It's hurting Canadians. It's making things unaffordable. It's making things uncertain. This comes on the heels of 2 years of sort of chronic uncertainty, so particularly unwelcome. We know that. We know inflation is keeping Canadians up at night. It's keeping us up at night, and we will not rest easy until we get it back down to target. And so that's why we're raising interest rates, and we're raising them, as you say, quite aggressively.
Now, with as you said, raising rates aggressively, and this is something we haven't experienced for a very long time. I guess, how will we know when and if what we're doing is actually having the effect? What will be the signs there? And I guess what signs might the bank also be looking for undesirable effects, side effects that maybe we hadn't anticipated? What are the things that, again, that we're looking at in terms of is this working, and in terms of this is doing more damage than good?
Yeah. Well, I think we're already seeing some impact of rising rates. We are seeing a bit of a moderation, particularly in the housing market. I know that's something Canadians pay very close attention to. We do as well. So that's certainly something we're looking at. We know the parts of the economy that are most sensitive to interest rate changes are where Canadians borrow. That's sort of how monetary policy works. It works at bringing borrowing costs up. So where the demand in the economy is dependent on borrowing, we will see a quicker reaction to rate increases. So that's something we're looking for. Obviously, we're looking for inflation to start to bend down again. As I said a few minutes ago, we think that's a little ways away yet, but we do think it'll happen. We also think as the pandemic continues to recede, some of the more global impacts on inflation will eventually tick down. And then, of course, we've got the effects of the war in Ukraine. So that's, the primary channel there is on commodity prices. So we'll be looking, ultimately, inflation is a measure of price increases on a year-over-year basis. We don't necessarily need to see all these prices come down again. What we do need to see is for them to level off, not to continue increase, and that alone will start to bring inflation down.
Now, we early in this inflation surge, I guess if we want to call it that, not just the Bank of Canada, but central banks in many countries were saying that this is a transitory event, that this is temporary, that there were some odd effects in the reopening, that this was going to fade. I think we can all agree now that even if there were transitory elements of it, this is not a transitory event. So I guess how should we look at it? If we were wrong about that, then what is it? And are there elements of what we're seeing now that are going to be longer, not just longer lasting than we expected, but more structural and permanent?
Yeah. No, you're right. As the governor said recently at one of our press conferences, one of our appearances at the House, I think it was, Team Transitory has disbanded. We no longer see some of these global effects as entirely transitory. But let me back up to sort of why that view was there in the first place. Historically, supply side shocks to the economy are things that are temporary. They are transitory. So that was, I think that is why, as you point out, not just the Bank of Canada, but central banks around the world viewed these things as temporary. We were also dealing with a situation that was quite extraordinary, and I think we were all at least hoping, if not expecting, would be temporary, pandemic. So I think it was, our thinking was as things return to normal, some of these things would recede. We actually still think that will happen. The difference, I think, is they're more persistent. If something goes on for, a year, you can hardly call it transitory. So we understand that. But we do expect the impacts will gradually unwind as the economy does return to normal. The important thing now, though, is we have to contain the domestic pressures on inflation, and very importantly, we have to keep Canadians' expectations of future inflation anchored. That's the lesson we have from history. We know from past experience that what we don't want to happen is for Canadians to assume that we're now living in a period of continued inflation. We're going to see, this type of inflation going forward. We will get inflation back to target. So we don't want to see it embedded in the economy.
While we're talking about sort of the, what has changed, what does the bank, in terms of what the economy looks like coming out of the pandemic? Have there been some permanent structural changes that we need to look at, things like whether it's growth or inflation or capacity? Are there elements that the pandemic may have permanently changed? I'm thinking about some of the things that we've been looking at in terms of labor supply and trade flows and supply chains. Are we going to see are we in the middle of structural changes that are going to basically redefine some of the questions that the bank has to ask all the time about the economy?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been through a pretty extraordinary event. One of the good news stories coming out of the pandemic and out of the economic impacts of the pandemic is just the degree of resilience and ingenuity that Canadians and Canadian businesses have shown. And so there's a reason to be optimistic that if we can leverage some of those things, if we can keep some of that momentum going, some of the investments businesses have made in delivering their products and their goods differently, investments in technology, digitization, that type of thing. Those are the type of investments that Canada has lagged on, as you've written about this. So if we can keep some of that momentum, keep that level of investment, there's reason to think that can improve overall productivity in the economy. That would be a good structural outcome. On the other hand, you can see, partly I think from the experience in supply chains over the course of the pandemic, partly from the effects of war in Europe. There's a bit of a retrenchment in trade relationships right now. There's a little bit of sort of protectionism kicking in. For a small open economy like Canada, that's a force we would hope not to continue. So, there will undoubtedly be a change in trading relationships, particularly coming off the back of the war. But I think we need to resist the idea that we all need to retrench back into a protectionist stance. The globalization has contributed to a long period of low, stable inflation. So a complete retrenchment would probably have a negative impact. So.
What about we were just obviously talking about retrenchment of trade. We've had our finance minister just this week talking about friendshoring and standing up at a podium with her U.S. counterpart, very much supporting what sounds like a sort of smaller world for multilateral trade, even if there is still a multilateral element. There's demographic shifts that get talked about a lot and sort of longer term growth potential, and again get tied into the inflation question. I guess where do you see some of these bigger issues in terms of where they leave, I guess for Canada in particular and globally as well, where they leave growth potential over the next 10, 15, 20 years?
Yeah, well, as I said, I think I think Canada in many ways is well positioned to take advantage of some of these structural shifts that you're talking about. This term friendshoring this is sort of one of the new terms that's come out, and the other one I've heard recently is ESGS. So the new S. I guess
before we go any further, are we familiar with friendshoring? Is this so new that we're?
Yeah. This is this idea of sort of containing your trading relationships to countries who have similar sort of political stability, respect for rule of law, maybe even share values, that type of thing.
And probably a fair bet that the main targets of a friendshoring strategy would be less China, less Russia.
Yeah, well, I think the idea is you would have fewer but deeper trading relationships. So yeah, that's that has potential upside, but as I said, what we wouldn't want to see is a complete retrenchment of multilateralism, a complete retrenchment to sort of a protectionist stance. That would not be a good outcome for a small, open economy like Canada. But I think there is room to be optimistic. Let's go back to the labor force. I think there's some structural changes there. It's quite remarkable when you look at the labor market is one of the clearest signs in Canada right now that we're in excess demand. So if you think about where we were 2 years ago, we had record unemployment, 13% unemployment, 3 million unemployed, 3 million underemployed Canadians, and now 2 years later we have 1 million vacancies. And if you talk to businesses right now, they'll tell you they're just having a really difficult time filling those jobs. So that's quite a sharp turn. And I mean, you recently wrote an interesting article that talked not just about the number of jobs that are being created, but also the quality of jobs that are being created. So an increase in the number of higher paying jobs. So it's exactly what's going on in the labor market right now isn't perfectly clear. I think we're definitely in a transition phase, but a really optimistic way to look at it would be that this period of time has given people an opportunity to reskill or upskill. People are now sort of better fitted to the jobs they're in. They're in higher paying jobs, so that's a bump in productivity. So now where we've got pressure in the labor market is the sort of entry level jobs. That makes sense if you think that we haven't had the same rate of immigration in Canada through the pandemic. So if we can get immigration back to its trend level and bring that into the employment market, you add those things together and there's a potential for boost in productivity. Then what we really need to see, like I said, is continued investment, right? This is where we've lagged in Canada. We need to see businesses investing in growing both their labor productivity and the overall business productivity. And there again, there's positive signs. Business investment was up 7% last quarter, and the businesses that we survey are telling us they do have strong intentions to invest. So again, a fairly optimistic outlook.
I want to bring us back again, maybe a little bit to the shorter term, and obviously interest rates, regardless of their direction, regardless of their level, have a profound effect on the housing market. I know they're not targeted to the housing market from the bank's perspective, but we're all keenly aware that that there's a disruption to the housing market from a rapid increase in rates. And the first part of the question I'd like to ask you about that is just how big does the bank, how much does the bank weight the housing risk in trying to assess how to apply rate policy right now?
So what I would say is, what we pay really close attention to is how the policy rate changes are affecting Canadians, all Canadians across the whole of the economy. As you say, we don't target any one element. We can't target. We have a very sort of blunt tool. But let me give you some numbers. So just over 60% of Canadians are homeowners. About 35% of Canadians have a mortgage on their home. The rest own their home outright. So you're looking, when you're talking about housing, really what you're talking about is mortgages when you're talking about interest rates. So that's a section of the economy. That's 35% of Canadians are holding a mortgage. Quite a bit smaller, about half of those people have a variable rate mortgage. Variable rate mortgages are more immediately affected by policy rates, of course. Fixed rate mortgages you won't see an impact till you go to renew your mortgage. And even those Canadians that are holding variable mortgages, only a small portion of those variable mortgages see their payments adjust with rates. Most mortgages are designed so that the payment's fixed. So in that sense, there isn't an immediate affordability or impact on Canadians' budgets. Having said that, there's a couple of ways that housing, I think, makes Canadians feel the impact of rate increases. One is just house prices. I think house prices are a big part of Canadians' wealth, and if house prices are moving around, if they're coming down, people feel that effect on their overall wealth, right? And then, there's lots of media attention to housing. So there's lots of articles being written right now speculating about, what will payments look like when people go to renew. So, that's creating stress for sure. We know that. We'll be watching this part of the economy really, really closely. But, the most important thing we can do for Canadians is to get inflation back down. 35% of people have mortgages, 100% of people buy groceries, most people fill up their car. You know, inflation is hurting everyone. So you know, our number one goal is to get inflation down.
We're here today sort of broadly talking about growth and risk, and so I did want to ask you about the way the bank looks at risk management. It's something that the bank has talked about a lot over the past few years. Stephen Poloz, the previous governor, made it a big focus. And I guess one thing I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit on risk management, because there are people, me included, who would argue that the upside risk of inflation was one the bank didn't respond particularly well to 6-8 months ago, and I'll leave that out there. Do you think the bank, in terms of understanding the inflation risk, may have leaned too much in the wrong direction?
So the time frame that you just put out 6-8 months ago was right around the time I was joining the bank. So. And at that point, we still had our forward guidance policy tool in place. So forward guidance is a way that we help stimulate the economy by holding interest rates down for a set period of time. And we describe that period of time as, you know, we would keep rates low until we saw the slack absorbed, which is basically a way to say that, you know, the economy had fully recovered, the employment was back to where it was before the pandemic started. So that's the first time we had used that tool in Canada. And you know, we had gone out, we had made that commitment to Canadians to hold that rate low until we saw that number. We had been reporting out on that number. And so we made that commitment, we stuck to that commitment. We thought that was really important to do. We want to preserve our ability, we want to preserve our credibility in using that tool. We want to make sure that tool is there in the future if we ever want to use it. So, you know, our view is we did what we said we were going to do. We did what we viewed as the right thing for the economy at that point in time.
Now let's move forward to now. What do the balance of risks look like, and how does the bank view those, both in terms of where we are on the balance of risks and which risks matter more to the bank on the two sides of the ledger?
Yeah, so now, you know, now we're in a very different environment. Now we've got inflation much too high, 7.7% out this morning. So the balance of risks are very much tilted to the upside of inflation. So right now, the way we're looking at this is the most important thing is to get inflation back to target. Of course, we want to do that with the least amount of unintended consequences as possible. We see a path to do that. Our view is that we can take some of the excess demand out of the economy, bring it back into balance, and that's what we're aiming to do. That's why we're increasing rates. That's why we're doing it quickly.
Okay, so 75 basis points in July, you're going to...
Yeah, well, we'll take the July decision when we get to July. You don't have too much longer to wait. July 13th is our next decision. You know, we've been clear all along. The economy's in excess demand. Inflation's too high. Rates need to go up. We'll get it there.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Carolyn. A round of applause for our guest, Carolyn Rogers. Thanks for coming, and I hope you guys found that enlightening.
I'm Doug Saunders, International Affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail, and I'm very pleased to be here to conduct our next interview with the individual who is perhaps best positioned to talk about Canada's future role and responsibility in the world. Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, has, I think it's safe to say, made a life out of stepping into bodies and institutions just as they are about to face their greatest test. Premier of Ontario during Canada's most difficult fiscal and economic crisis of the 20th century, interim Liberal Party leader during that party's moment of transition, and during that period, several times working as a mediator in difficult international humanitarian crises, including most recently as Canada's special envoy to Myanmar to deal with the mass expulsion and persecution of the Rohingya people, a crisis that continues and in common with the current crisis has produced enormous numbers of refugees, a challenge for Canada and other countries as well. But as for the current crisis, Bob Rae began his position as ambassador to the UN in 2020, and about 2 years into his post, it's safe to say that the UN and its member states faced an existential crisis on a scale that they hadn't since the end of the Cold War. I'd like to just begin by reading some words Bob Rae wrote a few weeks after the second Russian invasion of Ukraine. He wrote this in March. Vladimir Putin's decision to escalate his illegal war against Ukraine has created global turmoil as serious as any the world has experienced since the end of the Second World War. It raises the most fundamental questions about the nature of the world order and will force a major reassessment by every country in the world, including Canada, about how global governance and the enforcement of international law should work in the 21st century. There is no overstating the seriousness of the moment. So, hello, Bob Rae, coming to us from New York remotely. And
we're live from New York, anyway.
Live from New York, it's Bob Rae. 3 months after you said that, are we still in need of a major reassessment of the role of non-superpowers such as Canada in global institutions such as the UN? Has the UN been paralyzed and split in two?
No, I don't think the UN has been paralyzed, Doug. I think the UN can be compared to a lot of things, but actually it's a lot like an iceberg. What you see and the political side, obviously the Security Council has been paralyzed. That's true. The Security Council has not been able to respond to the aggression and the illegality of what one of their permanent members has done, and it continues to do, and that's disgraceful. And it's a reflection of the challenge facing the Security Council and the weakness of the Charter in giving the veto in a permanent way to those countries. But the UN itself has not been paralyzed. The UN itself has been very active, is being very active in responding to the crisis. And that, I think, is got to be emphasized. The Secretary General has been involved for the last several weeks in working with a number of countries on trying to figure out a way to get Ukrainian wheat and fertilizer from Russia into world markets, because without that, there's going to be this year there'll be a crisis of availability, and next year there'll be a crisis of supply in terms of actual being there for people. This is an example of what's being done. The humanitarian work that's being done by the UN on the ground in Ukraine and Eastern Europe is extraordinary. The speed with which the UN is able to respond on the ground to crisis situations is what allowed the World Food Program to win the Nobel Peace Prize last year. The World Food Program is an agency of the UN. I think politically, however, we have had to move around the Security Council in finding ways to respond effectively. And obviously, Canada's principal role has been as a member of NATO in our engagement with Ukraine on making sure that they have the ability to respond to the nature of the aggression. As well, we have used, and I think quite effectively, we've used the platform of the debates and the discussion in the UN to really try to play a leadership role in exposing what the Russians are doing and in not pulling our punches in what we're saying. And I can say that in everything I've done, I've had the full support of my government in trying to mobilize opinion globally on what the Russians are actually doing and how they've been doing it. And I think that's something where Canadians expect their country to be vocal and effective, and that's what we've been trying to do.
Right. Canada has managed to have a fairly prominent voice, in no small part thanks to your office, during this crisis. At the same time, it's revealed a challenge in doing things the way Canada has done things. You could say that since the end of the Second World War, Canada's way as a medium-sized power of engaging with the world or exercising its voice in the world is by being a slice in the pie, if you will, of international organizations that are doing beneficial things. We are a small slice of the pie in NATO. We're a varying sized slice of the pie in various UN organizations. But of course, what's happened since late February is that the UN and many of these organizations has become divided. The pie has been split in half. There's an emergence of an illiberal, authoritarian supporting bloc, and a block of liberal democracies that, not since the Cold War, are failing to communicate with each other. I see that the Prime Minister today is attending the Commonwealth Summit in an effort to try to convince some African states to join the position of the democratic countries of Europe and Asia in opposing the Russian invasion and that sort of thing. But do you find that this schism is irreconcilable and that it could hurt Canada's way of using institutions this way?
I think that's the longest question I've ever heard, but I with a lot of presuppositions in it that I don't really share. First of all, it's not true to say that we're a small piece of the pie. Canada is one of the top 10 donors to the United Nations. We're a much stronger presence here than you might know. We're one of the top 5 donors to the World Food Program. And I think our contributions are broadly recognized and widely appreciated in the UN system and globally. The schism that you refer to is hardly new. Ever since the process of decolonization started, there's been a serious issue within the world community as to how we look at each other and deal with each other. That hasn't changed. That's an ongoing challenge that we face and is not gone away. I think that what we are facing now, particularly with respect to, you referred to the Commonwealth meeting, the challenge with a number of countries in Africa and Asia is we need to understand some things that have happened that have had a real impact on them, and particularly looking at climate change, looking at COVID, for example. And to be perfectly blunt about it, the global response to both these crises, which are really ever present, not future issues when it comes to climate change. These are very present issues in Africa and in Asia. We have to understand that on adaptation, for example, the donor countries have not done a great job in responding, and there's pressure to do more, and there should be pressure to do more in dealing with drought and dealing with flooding and dealing with the impact that climate change is having on countries. And secondly, on COVID, we have to come to grips with the fact that the global response to COVID was uneven. We like to go around saying, well, we're all in the same boat. We're in the same boat now, and pandemic is there. It's affecting everyone. Reality is we're not in the same boat. We're in the same weather. Whether it's a pandemic or whether it's climate change, we're in the same weather. But we're being reminded every day by developing countries that actually some boats are much better kitted out than others. Some have done very, very well. Others have done much less well. And that response from the global community is one to which Canada actually, in the last, my knowledge, the work that we've done, has really been trying to say we have to bridge this gap between the developed world and the developing world, which is still a big gap. And COVID and climate change have accentuated that gap and have revealed that gap to be more serious than perhaps our rhetoric allowed us to believe. So we are, like other countries, going to have to step up. And I think we are, frankly, stepping up, as opposed to many other countries, including the UK, including a number of European countries, many of which have been sort of the seen as being in the front of development contributions. They've cut back. Canada has not cut back. Canada has actually increased our engagement. Now, we had a longer way to come, and we still have a longer way to go. But the Prime Minister and ministers of development and foreign affairs and finance ministers have been prepared to say, Canada's not pulling back in the face of this crisis. We're going to keep on pushing forward. And then we've also engaged much more energetically on looking at issues around financing for development and looking at issues of climate finance and how we assist more on adaptation. And again, we made a major contribution last year in decision last year in saying we're actually going to double what we're going to invest in on that front. So, yeah, there are differences of opinion and feeling, and I think we have to listen to the voices in Africa and in Asia which speak to this issue of, is there real solidarity or not? And I think that's something to which we are responding, and I think we're going to have to encourage our fellow members of the G7 and the G20 to respond as well.
Now, in what areas, if I can put it diplomatically, would it benefit? That's your job.
I'm not so sure.
In what areas would it be most beneficial for Canada to invest more? Whether you want to call them shortcomings or not, you've mentioned in Canada's role in international development, which has been stronger in terms of budgetary share in the past. Are there other areas where in the coming years Canada ought to be investing more internationally?
Well, I mean, I think that I took great interest in listening to my friend David Frum's presentation, and I think there's a lot of truth, frankly, in what he says about how clearly we are entering into a new period in terms of the competition between great powers, between the West and Russia. Obviously, Russia has I think behavior has nothing else should convince us that we cannot take security for granted in important ways, and the rise of China as a global economic and political and heading to military power is something that we have to take enormously seriously. And that is going to require a higher level of commitment, frankly, on every front. The Minister of Finance announced in her budget that there's going to be a broader review of defense spending in the next few months. That's happening now as we speak. And whether it's peacekeeping or NORAD or an Indo-Pacific strategy or what more we're doing in Europe, we need to understand that nothing comes easily, and we're going to have to play a role if we want to have a seat at the table. And I think that argument has been accepted by the government. The question really gets down to a very granular one of, well, exactly how do we do that in an effective way, and in a way that's going to reflect our overall commitments, and that's happening. Secondly, on development, I think again it's understanding that the nexus between development and peace and the resolution of conflict is a huge challenge in an enormous number of countries, where we're now seeing the first manifestation is a humanitarian crisis, whether it's the Rohingya crisis or crisis in Yemen or the crisis in many parts of Africa at the moment, the Horn of Africa, where there's conditions of famine. We have nearly 1 million people in the world who are literally facing starvation today, which is a number which is completely unacceptable. And we thought we had left that world behind, but we're there again with a vengeance. We have more people displaced, more refugees than we've ever seen before. And this is not going to get better quickly. And in order to deal with it, we're going to have to be prepared to engage more effectively. We can't do it alone. And sometimes when people look at our situation, say, well, what can Canada do about this? And I always say to people, it's not what Canada can do. It's what a group of countries can do. A group of countries that can make a difference. And with great respect to the comments that Conrad and others have made, we can't assume we're in a post-Trump era in terms of American leadership. We can see American leadership now more clearly at the United Nations, and we can see it globally in a way that we did not see it under President Trump. But we have to understand that the spirit of wanting to pull back and of committing less is alive and well in many different parts of the world, in Europe and in the United States and in part in Canada. And so my pitch to everybody is to say, we can't afford that. We can't afford to take that position. And we have to understand that if we want to be taken seriously in this conversation about democracy, about development, about conflict resolution, about advancing the interests of the rule of law. If we want to play a role in that, we have to match our talk with our walk. It's that simple. And if we don't, then we will be taken less seriously, and our rhetoric will seem more empty. And I think it's critical that these things be joined up.
Right. As you suggest, Canada faced what you might call a stress test during the years 2016 through 2021, when we had a sobering lesson in how well we can get by on the world stage without the United States as a reliable partner. And there were some interesting efforts to build alliances and blocs with other liberal democracies that were functioning, but it was a bit of a slap in the face in many respects. We were unable to solve a number of problems until the United States returned back to normal, ranging from a united voice on Russia to even getting our hostages back out of China. Do we need, if we're going to assume that those 4 years were not an interregnum between normal periods in the United States, but maybe this 4 years is the interregnum, do we need to be doing more to build relationships and alliances that do not necessarily have to involve the United States as the anchor?
Yes.
And how?
Well, I think it's a continuing obligation that we have. We are our own country. People say, well, we're only a small country. We're 40 million people. We're a member of the G7, active member of the G20. We're part of virtually every trading group going. We're members of the Commonwealth of Francophonie. We might just say, well, we're just a little tiny country. What difference can we make? The answer is we can make a hell of a difference if we decide that's what we want to do. And then it requires us to build the strongest possible partnerships. Let me give you a practical example. We've established a strong relationship with the Netherlands on the issue of accountability. And we have joined with the Netherlands in supporting Gambia's a case in front of the International Court of Justice on the issue of the genocide in Myanmar, and that is ongoing. We joined with the Netherlands in looking at what more can we do on torture in Syria and seeing there's ways of advancing that issue, focusing on that particular question. We're working with them on ICC issues in a very close way. That's a practical example of where two countries with very similar values, with tremendously strong relationships at every level, here in New York, in Geneva, Prime Minister being very close with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. This is an example of where you can actually do effective stuff. We work with Sweden on the IDEA Institute, which is an important body. We have many other countries joining with us at the Forum of Federations, which is an organization that I helped to start 25 years ago, which is still going and doing really good governance work in a number of countries where other countries have joined with us to say, we want to work with you, ranging from Germany to India to others where we work very, very, very effectively. The other area that it's of interest, just to give you another example, is where we're a major donor country in the world. As I've said, we're in the top 10. And so we need to work closely with, if you take the displaced people, the refugee crisis in the world, is say, how can we work effectively with those host countries where the majority of refugees are coming, and how can we play a stronger role in doing that? We're playing a strong role in Colombia. We're playing a role in the Central America, where the Americas have become an area of major migration and instability as a result of that migration, because of the way in which it's become a function of a response to the climate crisis and to other crises which are happening in a number of countries. These are just some examples where we have a very key role to play, and it's up to us as to whether or not we want to play them. And then it's up to us, are we prepared to really tell our story and say, this is what we're doing? And I think, again, that's where I believe that public diplomacy has a role to play. But the credibility of public diplomacy really depends on, once again, making sure that what we say reflects what we're actually doing. And to be honest, we're doing a lot more than Canadians, I think, realize we're doing. And we still have a way to go to make a point of talking to Canadians about what we're doing, as well as sharing with the world why we think these issues are significant and why we think they're important. And quite frankly, we need to plan for a world where we don't know what the developments in the United States or in Europe are going to be. We're going to have to be constructive and reliable partners with the Americans and with our friends in Europe every step of the way. But we're also going to have to make new friends, because the global kaleidoscope changes all the time, and we need to be aware of how that's changing and where we can be as constructive as possible.
A big part of what Canada has attempted to do, and that you've advocated for in writings and speeches over the years, is promoting its democratic and pluralist values, and ideally trying to cause them to spread and so on. Now, there's bound to be a criticism that who is Canada to be doing this? Certainly when Vladimir Putin deigns to mention Canada in his endless speeches, it's usually saying, something along the lines of how dare they try to speak up when they haven't dealt with the problems in their own house. And there are probably a lot of Canadians who would say, are we in a position to be promoting our values when we haven't fully reconciled the injustices and inequities that our country is historically built upon? Is there a role for the type of democracy promotion, democracy building that Canada has attempted in the past? Do we need more of that?
Well, I think that it's not like exporting democracy is not like exporting automobile parts. I mean, it's a different phenomenon entirely. On your first point about our own imperfections, I mean, if anybody who watches my speeches, you'll know I make no bones about the fact that we are dealing with our own legacy of injustice, which has been frankly foundational. And I've, in my earlier work on Indigenous issues inside Canada, I made a point of emphasizing the journey that we were on, and how there was no getting around the journey and no getting around admitting the truth about our situation. And as Murray Sinclair says, the truth will set you free, but at the beginning it'll piss you off, and it does. It should piss us all off at the point about where we've been and where we're going. But there's a need for us to share that experience with other countries. We're not coming into the debate and the discussion around pluralism and inclusion pretending that we're perfect. We're not coming in saying, do like us only. What we're saying is we share a history with many countries around the world that are the product of the same historical events as we have been. And we have an obligation to come to terms with that in our own country, but we also have an obligation to share our learning experiences and to share what they mean and to contribute to the rule of law, to contribute to a commitment to inclusion and a commitment to diversity. The way I have always put it, or for a long time I put it, is to say, look, the world is in us. Canada has become a truly global country by virtue of our population and our demographics, something that you yourself have written a lot about. And we have become a remarkable country as a result of a whole variety of decisions that have been made and taken in terms of immigration and the changing makeup of our country. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why it's very difficult for Canada to revert to being a kind of small isolationist country, because frankly our populations won't stand for it. But the second thing is that we are in the world, and so the question of being open and transparent about who we are as a country is essential. It's an essential part of it. Our preaching is not based on a pedestal of perfection. Our engagement is based on our own struggle with justice. Just as those of us who've had mental health issues embrace the cause of talking about mental health and telling people why it's important and reminding people why it's important. And I think that's the honesty that we have to bring to the discussion about democracy and pluralism. I think it comes with a profound humility. I think it comes with a really strong sense that we are not perfect, that we're not trying to export a model to other countries, but rather that we are trying to share experiences and also, from time to time, say there are some things that happen when you oppress a minority that are never pretty and never good. And however long you think you can do it for, eventually it blows up in your face. And I think frankly, that's a lesson of history that I think is clear to everybody. But I don't think we should. Of course, I mean, Vladimir Putin is going to say what he's going to say. President Xi is going to say, the Chinese, every visit I've made to China over the last 35 years, Chinese government, we talk about human rights, the Chinese always say, yes, but you have your own situation. And my answer is, well, when Vladimir Putin sets up a Truth and Reconciliation in Russia, give me a call. Let me know how that goes. It ain't happening. And I think we have to be honest and say, yes, we have a challenge in our country, but we are also facing up to it in a way that I think we need to continue to be proud of. And just as our walk and talk have to be lined up globally, they have to be lined up domestically. And I think that's something which the current government in Ottawa is really trying to wrestle with in a way that I think is a step beyond any other government that I've seen deal with this issue.
That's an inspiring moment to end this conversation on. Where I wish I could continue talking all afternoon, but you've managed to pack a lot of important messages into this short dialogue. Thank you, Bob Rae, for giving us your time, and I hope things go well for the next little while as we watch this unfold. We'll leave it there. Please thank me, everybody, in joining Mr. Rae for joining us today.
Thanks very much.